Hello and welcome to the final part of QED Stata 3, where we're going to look at this last part, S35, trying to see if there's any relationship between literacy, school enrolment and GDP per capita. So there's lots of ways you could tackle this. I've put some commands in the do file that will help you look at direct connection between literacy, GDP per capita, and then the three different measures we have of school enrolment, or rather just looking at the net measures, but for the three different things, so primary net, secondary net and female secondary net. So the first thing I'll do is the literacy connections GDP per capita, but I think that's the do file. So if you haven't done it, please have a go, see if you can put the commands in. Pause the video, but meanwhile I'll put them in from. Okay, so here's some commands that hopefully will let us look at adult literacy GDP per capita. So let's run that, and then I'll run it and I'll rearrange the graph so you can see what that looks like. Okay, so here's the first one, which is looking at literacy and GDP per capita. Problem you get here is, as with many things when you look at GDP per capita, is there's such a huge variation in GDP, and it's so heavily skewed and with a very positively skewed long tail that the data is completely non-normally distributed. It's quite hard to see correlations, but there does seem to be some sort of positive correlation in all the cases, but it's hard to pick out. So the solutions of that, similar to in the last lecture, you could either take the logs of the GDP per capita figure, so you get more of a normally distributed distribution to look at, or instead of that, when you're looking at correlations between things, instead of using the Pearson's correlation, you can try using the Spearman's correlation, which is why if you're sharp-eyed when you saw I'd done it in that do file, you'll see that the correlations, I hope that's visible, yes, I've got the PW correlation, which is the Pearson's standard one, and also the Spearman's one. So the Spearman's is using the rank, so it's less sensitive to that distortion. So let's have a look at what story they're telling in the starter results window. See here, positive correlations to the Pearson's, but really low. Whereas when you look at the ranks instead with the Spearman's, which is more appropriate for this non-normal data, you're picking up strong positive correlations, 69% between GDP per capita and literacy. And then if you lag it both ways, you're still picking out a correlation between literacy as it was 20 years ago and GDP today, is strongly positive correlation. And the other way is suggesting that GDP 20 years ago informs literacy, as though you can afford more schools and so on. So there seems to be evidence of causality both ways, and going back 20 years it was strangely less strong. Now you can tell us a story. I mean, there are many other things that you need to look at in terms of variables, but you could tell a story to yourself that, well, maybe 20 years in the past, GDP in many countries around the world was less reliant on a literate workforce, whereas now it is. So it's a stronger connection now between literacy and the workforce and production, possibly. Okay, so next step then is to go on and look at in a similar way using the charts, the Pearson's and the Spearman's, between the other measures of educational participation, primary enrolment, secondary enrolment, female enrolment, and GDP. What is I'll put the commands and I'll run them, but I'll just look at the correlation coefficients, because in all the cases the charts, as you see yourself, are quite difficult to read because of that highly skewed data. So if you want to pause it, I'll put the commands in and run them and then look at the coefficients in a moment. So hopefully you pause that. So I've got all three sections here: net primary enrolment, net secondary enrolment, net female secondary enrolment, GDP per capita, doing the scatters, looking at Pearson correlation, and the Spearman's, which is probably going to be more informative. So I can run all those, and then I'll pause the video while it's running because it takes a while to make all those graphs, and then we'll just look at the coefficients to finish with. So it's running, I'll just pause this. So here's the final set of scatter graphs with the female secondary education, per capita income. The others tell similar stories. That you can see there's some positive correlation there, but it's hard to make it out very clearly from these graphs because of the distortion of the highly skewed income data. But it seems that lagging the variables, they're still strongly correlated, but we need to look at the coefficients really to see what's happening here, which means we need to find where data has disappeared to underneath all the charts. There it is. Okay, so here we can see then that in all cases, so primary education, that was literacy, primary education and per capita income positive coefficients but quite low, but that's the Pearson's one. When you look at the Spearman's one, which is better for the lag data, it's really strong, 66%. And when you lag it, it's just as strong. When you lag the GDP per capita, it's virtually as strong. So quite strong evidence of causality there in both directions. Similarly for the secondary education, fairly strong on the Pearson's, even stronger with the Spearman's correlation coefficients. And there, when you lag the secondary education, that seems to be distinctly stronger. So evidence there is an effect from secondary education to income, and yeah, okay, yes, and here the same thing with female per capita, again quite reasonable coefficients of the Pearson's and higher still with the Spearman's. So when you lag the secondary education, educating women 20 years ago is distinctly higher. So quite, I mean, there are many variables, and you need a more sophisticated analysis. This is just looking at 2 variables at a time, but still, it's at least interesting evidence that it seems that there's is consistent with the idea that there's causality from female secondary education enrolment and GDP down the line in 20 years' time at least. So that's the end of that analysis with correlations. You can apply it to some of the other possible interactions between those effects. But for now, thanks for listening. The completed do file with everything on there is available to download, or you can use the one you just made. So in theory, if you take the do file, you've ended up with, if you're brave and you remove these stars here, and you've got the right address for the data file, you should be able to run it and do the whole thing again. But it'll take a while because it's got to download all that data, do all those graphs, but it should work. Okay, so I'll leave you to experiment with that. Hopefully it won't go too wrong. And for now, thanks for listening.